Another big thing we have to be mindful of to succeed in today's colocation environment is the way to evaluate your competition has changed. And if we're going to remain relevant in the future, we want to make sure that we're looking at the right data. And yeah, the kilowatts and the megawatts matter, the square footage matters, the tier rating matters to a certain degree, but if you're looking at it from a stranger's perspective that's never heard of your colocation company before, there's some more basic things that I want you to be clued into watching among your competitors. So if we're to remain relevant and select the right niches and avoid commoditization, the way we evaluate our competition has to change. So how can we evaluate, how can we analyze our competitive positioning? We looked at two baskets of colocation providers. By the way, none of these colocation providers that you're going to see up on the screen are NDA-protected clients, and the information that we're presenting is not private information. It's all available from third-party resources. It's just designed to give you kind of a framework and a lens to be able to evaluate what companies that you perceive to be your direct competitors are actually doing versus not doing. So we looked at a handful of large, emerging kind of international, national colocation providers. ByteGrid, they're in about 4 or 5 different markets, ColoCrossing, Cologix, Involta, Peak10, and vXchnge. Anyone here from any of those companies? Okay, which one?
Peak10.
Peak10, okay, cool. So you'll get to see how we kind of evaluated this. So we looked at some overall trends and what we found, and again, these aren't absolute numbers, just kind of look at them on a relative basis. We looked at for each of these companies who seemed to have the highest amount of traffic going to their website. This is based on data from a company that you might have heard of, Alexa, which is owned by Amazon. And the lower the number is, like a golf score, the better it is. So what we found is that ColoCrossing had more raw website visitors on a monthly basis than everyone else. ByteGrid and vXchnge were kind of at the other extreme. But 2 million Alexa is nothing to sneeze at. It's usually at least a couple thousand visitors a month. So in this handful of colocation providers we looked at, nobody was doing terrible. For the last several years, Google and Microsoft, to a lesser extent, have been rather public about saying that a lot of and they don't share a lot of what causes websites to rank well, because they know that that will cause people to game the system. But one thing that's very widely believed is that the quantity and the quality of your inbound links matter. So this is the linking domains that we found, and Peak10 has more linking domains than the handful of other colocation providers we looked at. Link authority is a weighted average on what the quantity and the quality of the link look like, and an overall grade looked at kind of holistic measures across the board that support a funnel for traffic generation, for lead generation, sales acceleration, and social media participation. We also looked at what some of these companies were doing on Google AdWords, at least what we were able to see publicly. It looked like ByteGrid and Peak10 were actively involved in Google AdWords, one for a considerably longer time than the other. They're both spending roughly the same amount, but one was getting a lot more clicks. Clicks in general, years ago people used to think were the be-all end-all. Clicks generally for your sales efforts are not inherently valuable if they don't become leads, and leads aren't inherently valuable if they don't become clients. But at least on a relative basis, it looks like ByteGrid is paying a lower cost per click than vXchnge, than Peak10. The years, obviously Peak10 has been doing this for a longer period of time. Organic clicks was also a proxy for what we thought was coming from organic traffic as opposed to referral traffic. But all this stuff shouldn't be looked at as absolutes. It just should give you an evaluation tool to be able to look more critically at what some of the companies that you perceive to be your direct competitors are actually doing versus not doing. I think it's also really clear, too, to recognize that there's direct competitors in colocation and indirect competitors. In other words, if you are a colocation provider that's doing $1 million in revenue, 2 million in revenue, 3 million in revenue, relatively small, you may run into times where you're competing against a regional or large national. And you'll see them as a competitor, but a large, like Equinix or Digital Realty or DFT, they're not necessarily going to see a colocation provider that's doing a couple million in revenue as a direct competitor to them. So in order for it to really be truly a direct competitor, it kind of has to be reciprocal. The challenge, too, is when so much of this buyer's journey is being fleshed out before they get to you, and it's a matter of intercepting them early on with helpful educational content that teaches them something valuable that answers their question. It's not just our direct and indirect competitors that we're going to bump into when we try to get on the page 1 of search results, whether it's organic or on a paid basis. We're also going to bump into all different kinds of business models that write about similar topics. So you may want to write about HIPAA tips that are relevant for healthcare CEOs in your local market, but your local business journal may be writing about that as well, and you may have to contend with that. There may be channel programs, there may be associations, conferences that are writing about, that are creating content around similar topics that you're going to have to outmaneuver. Another interesting thing that we looked at with these colocation providers is we looked at LinkedIn. We looked at how many employees were connected with them on LinkedIn, how many of those employees were in sales or business development roles, how many of those employees were active on LinkedIn in the last 30 days. I did a talk yesterday on LinkedIn social selling. There's a huge percentage of people that are on LinkedIn that log on once in a blue moon. So a big tip is if you're ever trying to reach somebody and you send them a message through LinkedIn and you don't hear back from them, don't assume that they're ignoring you. They just may not check LinkedIn on a regular basis. They may not have email alerting or be checking that. So just be mindful of that. But yeah, there were some small differences between there in terms of percentage of company that's in sales or business development, percentage of company that's in that's active on LinkedIn. We also looked at Glassdoor. How many of you have ever looked at Glassdoor from an employee or employer's perspective? Glassdoor is a really cool website if you're thinking of changing jobs, to think of what their current employees think of working there. So we looked at, among these 6 companies, what their ratings are, and they were very, very closely clustered together. Cologix, Involta, and Peak 10 had some reviews. Obviously, Peak 10 had more, Cologix had a little more. But there was pretty strong consensus on there. But it's just another external piece of data that you can get a pulse on. If people in the colocation space or MSP space or what have you feel that their people are their biggest assets, one of the interesting things to know is how happy those people are to be working there. How many of you calculate a net promoter score? NPS as part of your customer service? Okay, great. Progressive, forward-thinking companies will also frequently do this with their employees. They'll ask you, on the colocation side, how likely are you to recommend our colocation services to a friend? On the employee side, how likely are you to recommend working here as an employee to a friend? So another very interesting ranking signal to look like is hiring. How many of you, from a competitive analysis standpoint, look at the careers pages of some of the companies you compete with? Or look at their job listings to see what open positions they have. That's another signal. You can monitor their careers page. You can watch your LinkedIn stream. If you're connected with people that work at different companies, and there's the value of having a broad portfolio of LinkedIn connections is you see a lot of things that are happening as people change jobs and announcements and things tend to be reshared. But also, don't just look at the job title itself, but actually read the job descriptions. And one of the interesting things that we had is we saw actually Peak 10 was looking for a marketing operations manager a few weeks ago, and it was a very, very impressive job description that would, for anyone that does digital marketing in the colocation space, they're looking for some, I don't know if they fill this or not, but a very, very impressive skill set that they're looking for that would run circles around relatively small teams. And it's very unlikely that you'd be able to have the luxury of being able to attract that skill set if you didn't have at least a handful or two of full-time very digitally savvy marketers. So again, that's another signal to look at to see what's going on in your competitive spaces. What are they doing from hiring? Not just on a marketing or sales or business development or channel side, but you can look at what they're doing on engineering, on operations, on facilities, anything that you feel is strategically important to giving you leverage in the sales process. One of the interesting things too is a lot of times local colocation providers are going up against colocation providers of different sizes. So in a single location, the challenge, of course, from colocation is how are they going to address the questions about business continuity and backup and disaster recovery. How many of you are from colocation providers that are single locations? How many of you have partnered with other wholesale providers to be able to have a second location or more? Okay, so it's kind of a mixed bag there. What we find also is that when you look at kind of these mid-size colocation providers, and we were deciding what numbers to kind of crunch in and put some models through this presentation, there's kind of like local single location colocation providers. There's some interesting ones in the middle, and then we also, if we look at companies like Equinix and TierPoint and Digital Realty and DuPont Fabros, they have huge armies of people that take care of most of these things. Chances are the CEO isn't up at 2 o'clock in the morning worried about these exact same issues. But if you're from a company that doesn't have the resources of being like a publicly traded REIT or data center provider, these are definitely things to think about. With a lot of the smaller companies, it doesn't tend to be a huge investment in marketing and sales talent, or automation. Sales process a lot of times isn't very well benchmarked. There's not a good understanding of what the deal stages look like between when somebody becomes a lead versus a marketing qualified lead, a sales qualified lead, an opportunity, being able to keep track of the net value of the funnel. And as you look to scale sales, these are all really, really important things that your competitors are doing in the space, so they have a much better idea of what their future revenue stream looks like. And among the smaller providers, they tend to have a really poor grasp of product market fit. Yes?
The question, the third bullet point, investment in sales automation. Do you mean sales automation as in online purchasing or in the back-end CRM to track what's going on?
Most colocation providers are typically not using an e-commerce model where people are just buying on a self-service basis. If they are, it's usually because they're primarily in the web hosting business and it's a very low-ticket item. What we're talking about more is the marketing automation software, the sales, the CRM software, connecting all the dots together so you don't have 10 different systems with 10 different logins and nightmares about APIs and CSV files and lots of missed opportunities where you're sending an email to somebody and they get 3 different copies because it's in 3 different systems. So there's a lot of value in being able to pull that all together. And the sales cycle has become so fragmented with so many different touch points that it's really, really critical to be able to get a 360 view of what each person is doing, not just based on what they explicitly told you on forms that they filled out, but all the behaviors that they're exhibiting, all the blog posts that they're reading, all the videos they're watching, if they're attending webinars, if you're using something like Eventbrite for tracking, offline web, everything that you can do, SurveyMonkeys, everything you can do to pull into that timeline to get a much better idea as to what they really care about. Because, for example, if somebody lands on your website and they're reading 17 different articles about VPN encryption, well, you know, when you talk to them, you better be prepared to talk about VPN encryption. And it becomes a lot easier to personalize the sales process so you're not using a static elevator pitch. Because in this buyer's journey where the buyer is in control and the seller is kind of subservient now, it's really, really important to add a ton of value. One of the ways you can provide value is make sure that you're personalizing and customizing that experience based on what they really care about. Tools are a big important part of that. So again, the challenge is many of the local colocation providers and managed service providers are going after a lot of similar clients. They're selling different things, but they're going after similar clients. Some of the colocation providers, sales and marketing, although it may not be as robust as their larger competitors, in many cases it runs circles around the local MSPs. Kind of almost like the bully on the playground taking the lunch money from the wimpy kid. But if you want to partner with MSPs, you got to be able to build bridges and make them feel comfortable. Otherwise, they won't compete with you. One more threat that a lot of colocation providers and cloud service providers didn't think about a year ago. How many of you are kind of following what AWS is doing with managed services? If you had said a year ago that Amazon was going to be in the managed services business and anyone would be concerned about that at all, it just wasn't even on the radar screen. But as we've seen, whether it's grocery stores, whether it's memberships, I saw some statistic about a year ago that something like 60 or 70% of upper middle class households in the US have Prime memberships. The penetration is just off the charts. So it's really, really hard. In the same way that people used to fear what was Microsoft going to do next, in a lot of ways, it'd be really, really very, very important to make sure that you're continuing to figure out ways to add value to your clients beyond what they can get from large public cloud providers. And the answer is definitely going to change over time. That's the importance of that buyer persona research. It's the importance of constantly talking with your clients and figuring out what their next big challenges are, what their next big struggles are. So the question is, with colocation, the way colocation is purchased, the way it's researched has changed so drastically. Are you keeping up, or is your company kind of living in the past?